June 4, 1942, Pacific Ocean, north of Midway Atoll. Dawn arrives quietly over the vast Pacific. A pale orange sun rises above calm water. Long waves roll gently beneath four of the most powerful warships ever built, the Japanese aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Together, they form the core of Japan's legendary carrier strike force, the Kido Butai. For months, this fleet has dominated the Pacific. From Hawaii to the Indian Ocean, no enemy navy has been able to stop it. On the flagship Akagi, Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagamo studies reports arriving from scouting aircraft. The operation is unfolding exactly as planned. Soon, Japanese aircraft will strike the American base on Midway. Soon, the remaining American carriers will appear. Soon, Japan expects another victory. Below on the hangar decks, mechanics refuel aircraft, bombs are rolled into position. Torpedoes wait beside rows of attack planes. The fleet moves confidently across open ocean. But far beyond the horizon, American dive bombers. 6 months before the catastrophe near Midway Atoll, the balance of power in the Pacific had already been violently shaken. On the morning of December 7, 1941, aircraft launched from Japanese carriers struck the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. In one of the most shocking attacks in modern military history, the attack on Pearl Harbor, within hours, battleships burned in the harbor. Smoke covered the island of Oahu. More than 2,400 Americans were dead. For Japan, the attack seemed like a stunning success. The goal had been simple: destroy American naval power in the Pacific long enough for Japan to secure its rapidly expanding empire. And in the months that followed, it appeared to work. Japanese forces swept across Asia and the Pacific with astonishing speed. Hong Kong fell. Singapore collapsed. The Philippines were overwhelmed. Allied positions across Southeast Asia crumbled under relentless attacks. Behind these victories stood the most powerful naval striking force in the world. The Kido Butai, this massive carrier task force, represented a revolutionary way of fighting at sea. Instead of battleships firing at each other across the horizon, aircraft carriers now projected power hundreds of miles away through waves of attack planes. At its peak, the Kido Butai included 6 major fleet carriers, among them the formidable Akagi and Kaga, veterans of the Pearl Harbor strike. Each carrier was essentially a floating airbase. Their decks launched fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo aircraft capable of destroying fleets far beyond visual range. The architect behind this new style of warfare was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of Japan's combined fleet. Yamamoto understood something many naval officers still resisted: the era of the battleship was ending. Air power would decide the future of naval warfare, but Yamamoto also understood something else. Japan was fighting a dangerous war against a nation with vastly greater industrial capacity. The United States possessed enormous shipyards, factories, and manpower. If the war dragged on for years, American production would eventually overwhelm Japan's navy. For that reason, Yamamoto believed Japan had only one chance: deliver devastating blows early in the war, break American morale, force the United States to negotiate before its full strength could be mobilized. The strike on Pearl Harbor had been the first step, but it had one crucial flaw. America's aircraft carriers, the most important ships in the Pacific Fleet, were not in the harbor that morning. They had escaped destruction, and that meant the war at sea was far from decided. Throughout early 1942, American carrier groups began launching daring counterattacks across the Pacific. Small raids struck Japanese-held islands. Reconnaissance aircraft probed enemy defenses. Then, in April 1942, something happened that shocked Japan's leadership. 16 American bombers launched from the carrier USS Hornet. CV-8 flew directly toward the Japanese homeland during the daring Doolittle raid. The physical damage was limited, but the psychological impact was enormous. For the first time in centuries, enemy aircraft had bombed Japan itself. The attack humiliated military leaders and exposed the vulnerability of the empire. Admiral Yamamoto now believed decisive action was necessary. If the remaining American carriers could be destroyed in a single massive battle, Japan might still secure control of the Pacific. To achieve this, Yamamoto developed an ambitious and complex operation. The target would be a tiny American outpost located roughly halfway between Asia and North America. A remote coral island surrounded by open ocean, a place that would soon become the stage for one of the most decisive naval battles in history. Midway. And as the massive Japanese fleet began moving eastward across the Pacific, the commanders aboard its carriers believed they were sailing toward another certain victory. They did not yet realize that American intelligence was already waiting for them. While the Japanese fleet prepared its bold advance toward Midway Atoll, a quiet intelligence battle was already unfolding thousands of miles away in Hawaii. Inside a secure basement at Pearl Harbor, a small group of American cryptanalysts worked day and night attempting to break the Imperial Japanese Navy's complex communication codes. This secret operation was conducted by Station HYPO, one of the most important intelligence centers in the Pacific War. The men inside the room were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They fought with pencils, typewriters, and stacks of intercepted radio messages. At the center of this effort stood Commander Joseph Rochefort. Rochefort and his team had spent months studying the Japanese naval code known as JN-25. The system constantly changed, and large portions of it remained unreadable, but piece by piece, patterns began to emerge. Certain locations appeared repeatedly in Japanese communications. One of them was referred to only by a mysterious code, F. American analysts suspected AF might represent Midway, but suspicion alone was not enough. The U.S. Navy needed proof. So, Rochefort's team devised a simple but brilliant test. The American base at Midway was instructed to send an uncoded RDIO message reporting that its freshwater supply system had failed. Soon afterward, Japanese intercepts reported that AF is short of water. The code had been cracked. AF was indeed Midway Atoll. This discovery gave American commanders something almost unheard of in warfare: advanced knowledge of the enemy's battle plan. The information was quickly delivered to the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. Nimitz immediately recognized the opportunity. If Japan was planning to attack Midway, then the American carriers could be positioned nearby in secret. Instead of reacting to a surprise assault, they could ambush the Japanese fleet. But the situation was still dangerous. After months of losses, the United States had only 3 operational aircraft carriers in the Pacific: USS Enterprise, CV-6, USS Hornet, CV-8, USS Yorktown, CV-5, and even this small force was not fully ready. Just weeks earlier, Yorktown had been heavily damaged during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Under normal circumstances, repairs would take months. Instead, shipyard workers at Pearl Harbor worked around the clock in one of the most remarkable emergency repair efforts of the war. In just 72 hours, the carrier was patched, refitted, and sent back into combat. Meanwhile, American commanders carefully positioned their ships northeast of Midway, hidden beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. Operational command of the carrier task force was placed in the hands of Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, a calm and methodical officer known for his discipline and strategic thinking. The plan was simple and theory. On the morning of June 4, 1942, thousands of Japanese sailors and aviators were already awake aboard the carriers of the Kido Butai. Life aboard an aircraft carrier was intense even in calm conditions. Inside the narrow hangar decks of ships like Akagi and Kaga, mechanics worked in tight spaces surrounded by fuel lines, bombs, and aircraft wings, folded like metal birds. Carrier warfare required perfect coordination. Deck crews had to move aircraft into position, refuel them, load bombs or torpedoes, and launch them in carefully timed waves. A single mistake could lead to disaster. Japanese carrier crews were among the most experienced in the world. Many of them had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, where their aircraft had struck American battleships with devastating precision, but the work was dangerous. A carrier hangar deck was filled with aviation fuel vapors. Explosive ordnance lay only a few meters from hot engines and spinning propellers. In combat conditions, the risk multiplied. Pilots waited beside their aircraft wearing parachutes and heavy flight gear, ready to launch at a moment's notice. Many of them were elite naval aviators who had trained for years in one of the most demanding flight programs in the world. They believed they were part of an unstoppable force for the Japanese Navy. The carrier fleet represented not only military strength but national pride. Few aboard those ships imagined that within hours their floating airfields would become burning wrecks. Yet the very complexity of carrier operations, the fuel, the bombs, the crowded decks, would soon turn their greatest strength into their greatest vulnerability. And the moment that vulnerability appeared would come from a chain of tactical decisions unfolding far above the ocean. Angle 2, Yamamoto's strategic gamble. The battle that unfolded near Midway Atoll was not an accident. It was the result of a carefully designed plan created by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of Japan's combined fleet. Yamamoto understood that the early victories of 1941 and early 1942 could not continue forever. Japan had captured enormous territory across Asia and the Pacific, but its industrial resources were limited compared to those of the United States. If American shipyards and factories fully mobilized, they could eventually produce far more ships and aircraft than Japan could ever match. Yamamoto's solution was decisive battle. Japanese naval doctrine had long emphasized the idea that one massive fleet engagement could determine the outcome of a war. If the remaining American carriers could be destroyed in a single operation, Japan might gain enough strategic advantage to force negotiations. Midway was chosen as the bait. By attacking the island, Japan hoped to lure American carriers into a trap where the powerful Kito Butai would destroy them. But the plan was extraordinarily complicated. Japanese forces were divided into multiple groups, spread across thousands of miles of ocean. Battleships, cruisers, invasion transports, and carrier strike forces all had separate roles in the operation. In theory, this allowed Japan to cover a vast area. In practice, it reduced coordination and made communication difficult. The success of the plan depended heavily on surprise, but surprise had already been compromised by American codebreakers. Yamamoto did not yet know that his carefully prepared ambush was sailing directly into one of its own. While fleets moved across the Pacific, the real battle had already begun inside the quiet rooms of Station Heipo. Their cryptanalyst, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had managed to decode enough of Japan's naval communications to predict the attack on Midway. This information reached Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, who immediately began preparing a counterattack. The advantage this intelligence provided cannot be overstated. Naval battles in the Pacific often depended on chance encounters between fleets separated by hundreds of miles of open water. Finding the enemy first usually meant winning. By positioning American carriers in advance, Nimitz transformed the situation. Instead of searching blindly for the Japanese fleet, American aircraft would be launched from hidden carriers waiting in ambush. Operational command of those carriers was placed under Admiral Raymond de Spruance, whose calm decision-making would soon prove crucial. Yet even with this advantage, the battle was far from certain. Japanese naval aviation remained extremely powerful. Their fighters, especially the feared Mitsubishi A-6M0, had dominated Allied aircraft across the Pacific for months. If the American carriers were discovered first, the entire ambush could collapse. The outcome would depend on timing. A few minutes could determine whether aircraft found enemy carriers ready for battle or dangerously exposed. And on the morning of June 4th, that timing began to unfold in a way no commander could fully control. By 1942, naval warfare had entered a new era. Battleships still existed, but the real striking power now came from aircraft launched far beyond the horizon. Both sides in the Pacific War depended heavily on carrier aviation. The Japanese carrier fleet operated some of the most effective aircraft of the early war. Among them was the highly maneuverable Mitsubishi A-6M0, a fighter that had shocked Allied pilots with its agility and long range. In offensive strikes, Japanese carriers relied heavily on aircraft such as the Aichi D-3A and the torpedo bomber Nakajima B-5N. These aircraft had already demonstrated devastating effectiveness during the attack on Pearl Harbor, where they helped cripple the American Pacific Fleet. American carriers, however, had their own powerful aircraft. One of the most important was the Douglas SBD Dauntless. The Dauntless was not the fastest aircraft in the sky, but it possessed two critical advantages: reliability and precision. Its design allowed pilots to dive steeply toward enemy ships, releasing bombs with remarkable accuracy before pulling away at the last moment. Against heavily armed warships, accuracy mattered far more than speed. A single well-placed bomb could ignite aviation fuel, detonate ammunition, or destroy vital command centers. And because aircraft carriers stored large amounts of fuel and explosives on their decks and hangar levels, they were particularly vulnerable when caught during active flight operations. This vulnerability would soon become tragically clear. Naval battles unfold across vast distances, but their outcomes often depend on the decisions of a few individuals. On the Japanese side, tactical command of the carrier strike force belonged to Vice Admiral Keiichi Nagamo. Nagamo was an experienced naval officer, but he had built his career commanding torpedo boats and surface ships rather than aircraft carriers. Carrier warfare required rapid decisions in constantly changing conditions. On the morning of June 4th, Nagamo faced a difficult problem. His first wave of aircraft had already been launched toward Midway Atoll to attack the American base, but reconnaissance aircraft soon reported that the initial strike had not completely destroyed Midway's defenses. Nagamo now had to decide whether to launch another attack on the island or prepare his aircraft to strike possible American ships. Aircraft inside the carrier hangars were in the process of being rearmed. Bombs intended for land targets were removed and replaced with torpedoes designed for attacking ships. This process required time. Bomb carts moved through crowded hangar decks. Fuel hoses connected to aircraft. Mechanics worked quickly beneath wings and propellers. Meanwhile, American forces were already approaching. On the American side, Admiral Raymond de Spruance commanded the carrier task force. That included USS Enterprise, CV-6, USS Hornet, CV-8, and the recently repaired USS Yorktown, CV-5. Spruance was known for calm discipline rather than dramatic leadership. His orders from Admiral Chester W. Nimitz were clear. Strike the Japanese carriers as soon as they were located, but there was risk. Launching aircraft too early might mean they would not find the enemy. Launching too late could allow the Japanese carriers to strike first. Spruance chose to launch his aircraft at long range, a bold decision that would send American planes flying hundreds of miles over open ocean searching for the Japanese fleet. Whether they would arrive in time remained uncertain. Carrier battles often hinge on timing measured in minutes. On the Japanese carriers, flight operations had created a dangerous situation. Aircraft returning from the Midway strike were preparing to land. Other aircraft inside the hangars were being refueled and rearmed for potential attacks against American ships. Fuel hoses lay across the decks. Bombs and torpedoes waited on loading carts. Aircraft filled both the hangar decks and portions of the flight decks. This was normal procedure during large carrier operations, but it also meant that the carriers temporarily contained enormous amounts of exposed fuel and explosives. At the same time, Japanese fighter aircraft, primarily the Mitsubishi A6M0, were flying low over the fleet attempting to intercept American torpedo bombers that had already begun attacking. Those early American attacks achieved little direct damage, but they forced the Japanese fighters downward toward sea level. For a brief moment, the skies high above the fleet were left nearly unprotected, and at that exact moment, another group of aircraft was approaching unseen from high altitude. They were American Douglas SBD, Dauntless aircraft. Within minutes, they would begin diving toward the Japanese carriers. What happened next would become one of the By late morning on June 4, 1942, the battle near Midway Atoll had already become chaotic. Multiple waves of American aircraft had attacked the Japanese fleet. Many of them came from Midway itself. Marine fighters, torpedo planes, and Army bombers launching desperate strikes against the powerful carrier force. Most of these attacks failed. Japanese combat air patrols, flying the highly maneuverable Mitsubishi A6M0, intercepted many of the incoming planes before they could reach the carriers. Other American aircraft pressed through intense anti-aircraft fire only to miss their targets. Torpedoes splashed harmlessly into the sea. Bombs exploded far from their intended targets. For the Japanese crews watching from the decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, these attacks seemed to confirm their confidence. Enemy aircraft were being shot down. The fleet remained intact. But beneath that appearance of control, the situation was becoming dangerously complicated. Fighter pilots from the Mitsubishi A6M0 squadrons were forced to chase American torpedo bombers at extremely low altitude. These slow torpedo aircraft, including those launched from the American carrier, USS Hornet, CV-8, flew straight toward the Japanese fleet despite overwhelming odds. Many of them were destroyed before they could release their weapons, but their sacrifice had an unintended consequence. Japanese fighters descended lower and lower to intercept them. Meanwhile, the carriers themselves were in a vulnerable state. Inside their hangar decks, aircraft were still being prepared for new strike missions. Fuel lines remained connected. Bombs and torpedoes were stacked near aircraft waiting for launch orders. Carrier operations required speed. But speed also meant risk. A single bomb striking the wrong place could ignite everything at once. High above the clouds, two American dive bomber squadrons were approaching the Japanese fleet from different directions. These aircraft came from the carriers USS Enterprise, CV-6, and USS Yorktown, CV-5. They flew the sturdy Douglas SBD Dauntless, a plane designed specifically for steep, precision bombing attacks against ships. But finding the Japanese fleet had not been easy. The vast Pacific Ocean offered few landmarks. Navigating across hundreds of miles of empty sky required careful calculations and a great deal of luck. Several American squadrons had already become separated or lost while searching for the enemy. One group of dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, continued searching long after their fuel supplies had begun to run low. Then McCluskey noticed something unusual. Far below, a lone Japanese destroyer was racing across the ocean at high speed. It was the Arashi. The destroyer had been pursuing an American submarine earlier in the morning and was now attempting to rejoin the main fleet. McCluskey made a critical decision. If the destroyer was rushing somewhere, it was probably heading back to the Japanese carriers. He ordered his aircraft to follow its wake. Moments later, the clouds parted. Below them lay the heart of the Kido Butai. 4 Japanese carriers sailed across the ocean in formation. Smoke from anti-aircraft guns drifted through the air. Fighter aircraft circled low above the fleet. But the sky above them was nearly empty. The American dive bombers had arrived at exactly the right moment. Within seconds, the pilots began pushing their aircraft into steep dives. Air brakes opened. Engines roared as the Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft plunged toward their targets. Below them, Japanese sailors suddenly pointed upward. Sirens began to sound, but it was already too late. At approximately 10:22 a.m., American bombs began falling toward the carriers. And in the next few minutes, 3 of the most powerful warships in the Japanese Navy would be transformed into burning wrecks. At 10:22 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the battle above the Japanese carrier fleet reached its decisive moment. High above the formation, American Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft rolled into steep dives. Their targets were the carriers at the heart of the Kido Butai. Below them, the Japanese fleet had only seconds to react. Fighter aircraft from the Mitsubishi A6M0 patrols were still flying low over the ocean, engaged with earlier American torpedo attacks. Very few fighters remained at high altitude to intercept the dive bombers. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, sending bursts of black smoke into the sky. But the American aircraft were already descending rapidly. Their steep dives made them difficult targets. Within moments, the first bombs began falling. One group of American aircraft targeted the carrier Kaga. The massive carrier was crowded with aircraft on its deck. Bomb carts and fuel lines were still scattered across the flight deck as crews continued preparing planes for launch. Then the bombs struck. Multiple explosions tore through the carrier's deck almost simultaneously. One bomb penetrated the hangar deck before detonating among armed aircraft. The resulting explosions ignited aviation fuel and ammunition. Within seconds, flames began racing across the carrier. Nearby, another group of dive bombers attacked Soryu. 3 direct hits shattered the flight deck. Fires erupted below decks where aircraft were being refueled. Black smoke rose rapidly into the sky. Damage control crews rushed to contain the fires, but the explosions had already spread through the hangar areas where bombs and torpedoes were stored. The carrier quickly became engulfed in flames. At almost the same moment, Another group of American dive bombers descended on the flagship Akagi. Akagi was the command ship of Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagamo. Compared with the other carriers, fewer bombs struck her directly. But one bomb landed near the center of the flight deck. The explosion penetrated into the hangar area where fully fueled aircraft and armed torpedoes were waiting. The effect was catastrophic. Flames erupted across the hangar deck. Fuel lines burst open. Explosions followed as torpedoes and bombs began detonating inside the ship. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers had been crippled. Thick columns of black smoke climbed thousands of feet into the air. From a distance, the fleet appeared to be burning. The speed of the destruction shocked even the American pilots who had delivered the attack. What had taken months to build and train, the elite carrier power of the Japanese Navy, had been shattered in a matter of minutes. But the battle was not yet over. One carrier had escaped the first wave of attacks. The carrier here remained operational. Her commanding officers quickly organized a counterstrike. Aircraft were launched toward the American fleet in 2 waves. Their target was the American carrier USS Yorktown, CV-5. Japanese dive bombers located Yorktown later that afternoon. Despite fierce anti-aircraft fire and defending fighters, several bombs struck the American carrier. Explosions ripped across her deck. Damage control crews worked desperately to contain the fires and keep the ship afloat. Soon afterward, Japanese torpedo bombers attacked again. 2 torpedoes slammed into Yorktown's hull, causing severe flooding. The ship lost power and began to list heavily. For a moment, it appeared that Japan might still salvage some victory from the battle. But American reconnaissance aircraft soon located the last remaining Japanese carrier. Late in the afternoon, dive bombers from the USS Enterprise, CV-6, launched a final attack. They found Hiryu alone on the open ocean. As the American Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft descended, bombs struck the carrier with devastating effect. Explosions ignited fires across the flight deck. Soon, Hiryu 2 was burning uncontrollably. By nightfall, all 4 Japanese carriers that had launched the attack on Midway were either sinking or doomed. In a single day, the core of Japan's carrier strike force had been destroyed, and with it, the balance of naval power in the Pacific had begun to shift.